The story I brought today is related to the television industry. One of my acquaintances is still working in the broadcasting industry, so I'm going to filter out a few details to protect the people involved. I believe I first heard this story from him sometime around 2017. He is currently working as a variety show writer. At the time this happened, he had been working in the industry for about 4 or 5 years. Variety show writers work on a lot of programs in Korea, of course, but many of them also work on productions overseas. Some writers are employed directly by a broadcasting company, but many work as freelancers. When a particular program begins production, they join the writing team for that show. Others are part of what are often called a famous producer's PD team or producer's circle. The person who told me this story was working as a freelance writer at the time. Then, through a senior writer she had become close to while working on a previous program, she received an offer to work on a show in China. Her senior writer asked her, "Would you like to come with us?" She had heard from other writers that many Korean variety show writers went to China to work on television programs, but this would have been her first time going herself. So she asked a lot of questions. How is the production organized? Which broadcasting station is it? In Korea, we have the major national broadcasters, along with cable networks that operate nationwide. But in China, there are many broadcasting stations that operate independently in different regions. There are separate stations near the borders, as well as stations in Shanghai, Sichuan, and countless other regions. This particular offer came from a broadcasting station in a city somewhere in China. I won't reveal the exact location, but it was a fairly large city. Usually, 4 writers traveled together for this kind of work. There was the senior writer who had made the offer, another writer with a similar amount of experience, the main character of today's story, and one junior writer who had only been working in the industry for about a year. That junior writer is the person I'm going to call Dolby. Dolby had only been working as a television writer for about a year, but she had already worked on 2 programs with the senior writer who recommended her. Because the senior writer had so much experience, she usually didn't directly manage the most junior writers herself. Instead, she would often ask writers with a few years of experience, "Do you know any good junior writers who might be able to come with us?" And that's how Dolby was chosen. But there was actually one concern about bringing Dolby along. She was an extremely hard-working and capable writer, but there was one thing that made her a bit of a risk. At the time, Dolsoon knew that Dolby had developed something of a gambling problem. She had been interested in things like betting games and sports betting, and Dolsoon also knew that Dolby had been struggling because of it. So she thought, other than that, she's a really good person, and she says she's genuinely reflected on what happened. Maybe I should give her a chance to start over. With that in mind, Dolsoon contacted Dolby and asked her to come along. In every other way, Dolby was a genuinely hard-working and responsible person. Her gambling was the one exception. At the time, she was earning only around 1.3 to 1.4 million won a month as a junior writer. That was actually below the minimum wage in 2017. The reason was that writers were paid based on the number of episodes that aired, and junior writers didn't have many episodes credited to them. So financially, she was in a very difficult position. But if a writer went to China, even a 4-month project could pay a junior writer around 50,000 yuan. You might be wondering how much that was worth at the time. Including the 50,000 yuan she received for the 4-month project and the living expenses covered during her stay, I remember it coming to somewhere around 8 million won, perhaps close to 9 million won depending on the exchange rate at the time. That meant she could earn almost a year's worth of income in just 4 months. That's why, from what I heard, many Korean writers were willing to go all the way to China for these projects. And because Dolsoon wanted to give Dolby a chance to start over, she decided to bring her along. When they arrived at the small to medium-sized Chinese broadcasting station, there were apparently 2 local brokers who helped connect Korean writers with Chinese productions. These brokers didn't just connect Korean writers with jobs, they also helped them deal with the practical difficulties of living in China. There were all kinds of expenses involved, and the language barrier could be a serious problem. So these brokers helped with communication and daily life as well. The contract was for roughly 3 months of production, followed by about 2 weeks of post-production, such as editing. After that, the writers were supposed to have around 2 weeks of free time to travel around China before returning home. For the first 3 months, there apparently weren't any major problems on the surface. The schedule was intense, and the travel between locations was exhausting, but apart from that, Dolby reportedly thought, "It's not that different from Korea, and I'm making a lot of money. I'm really happy." However, as time went on, Dolby's expression reportedly became noticeably darker. At first, everyone assumed she was simply tired from being away from home. She was also the youngest writer on the team, so she had to run around constantly and handle all kinds of errands. But by the final month, something strange happened. I later heard that Dolby had returned to Korea earlier than planned. The strange part was that the 3 months of filming had already ended, and even the post-production work had been completed. Yet only a week later, Dolby suddenly returned to Korea. She told them, "I think I have to quit this industry. I don't think I can do this anymore." And then she cut off contact. Dolsoon didn't hear this directly from Dolby. She heard about it from the second most senior writer. Naturally, she began wondering, what happened? And this is the story that Dolsoon eventually heard from that writer. From this point on, I'm going to tell the story from Dolby's perspective. When Dolby left for China, she was already carrying around 10 million won in gambling debt. She kept thinking, how am I ever going to pay this back? She was only earning around 1 million won a month, so there was no realistic way for her to clear the debt quickly. Then this opportunity to work in China came along. She thought, maybe this is my chance to get back on my feet. I need to reflect on what I've done and start living normally again. With that determination, Dolby left for China. Dolby was working hard in China, but she didn't have any friends there. The only people she knew were her co-workers, and they were basically her superiors. And because she was the only man in the group, she started feeling extremely lonely. After about a month, she began relying heavily on one of the brokers I mentioned earlier. For convenience, I'm going to call the broker Wang Zhang. Apparently, Wang Zhang was around the same age as Dolby, and they were both men. Wang Zhang could also speak some Korean, so Dolby found it easier to talk to him. One day, Dolby told him, "I'm under so much stress here, and I'm so bored. Is there anything fun to do?" Wang Zhang then asked, "Do you have any money?" Fortunately, Dolby had received around 10,000 yuan in advance as a living allowance. Since she was going to be staying in China for several months, the production had given her roughly 10,000 yuan to cover her living expenses. And 10,000 yuan was not a small amount of money. At the time, it was worth roughly 1.7 to 1.8 million won. And since most of her meals and basic expenses were covered during the day while she was on set, she wasn't actually spending much of it. So, in reality, most of that 10,000 yuan was money she had left over. Dolby told Wang Zhang, "I have about 10,000 yuan. Is there anything fun I can do?" Wang Zhang then asked, "Do you know how to play cards?" "Of course I do." "Do you know how to play mahjong?" Dolby replied, "Yeah, I can play mahjong too. I like all kinds of card games and board games. I can play pretty much anything." Wang Zhang then said, "Well, playing for nothing isn't very exciting, but there is a place where people play for small amounts of money. I go there sometimes. You might even be able to make a little money while you're there." And that's how Wang Zhang began luring Dolby in. For someone like Dolby, it was an extremely tempting offer. She had genuinely decided to turn her life around and start working hard again, but gambling is notoriously difficult to quit. So after filming ended each night, Dolby began leaving the accommodation with Wang Zhang and visiting what was, essentially, an underground gambling den. At first, things went exactly the way you would expect. Dolby started winning some money. She kept winning a little here, a little there, and continued gambling. Then, about 2 months into the project, a problem came up at the production she was working on. It wasn't anything serious at first. The problem was that Dolby had an issue with her visa. Because of that, they discovered that there was a problem with paying her salary directly into a bank account. The senior writer, as well as the second and third year writers, had all obtained work visas and opened bank accounts in China. But Dolby, being the newest writer, hadn't known that she needed to do the same. So the production team told her, "Then we'll pay you in cash instead." But there was one problem. When you return to Korea, each person can only take up to 20,000 yuan in cash out of the country. But since you were going to receive around 60,000 yuan while you were there, they suggested that the four of you could split the money up and bring it back separately so there wouldn't be any problems. The senior writers also said, "We'll carry some of it for you. We're a team, after all. You can receive your salary and keep it with you for now, and then we'll divide it up among ourselves at the airport before we go through." So from that point on, Dolby had even more cash on hand. Every payday, another 20,000 yuan would come in, one payment after another. The amount of cash he had kept growing. Then Wang Zhang showed up again. He said, "You also have the money you won gambling, don't you? Wouldn't it be a problem if you took all this cash back with you?" By that point, Dolby had accumulated around 90,000 yuan. In a way, he had made a lot of money over the course of those 2 months, although some of it had come from his salary and other circumstances. But 90,000 yuan was far too much for the four of them to simply divide up and carry back into the country. From this point on, Wang Zhang began tempting Dolby with a different proposition. Have you ever heard of hwanchigi? In Korea, hwanchigi refers to an illegal method of moving money across borders by using a third party to transfer funds domestically instead of physically carrying the money across the border. Listen. If you try to take all this money back through the normal channels, you'll definitely get caught at the airport. And if you buy gold or a watch and try to take it home, they'll find it 100% of the time. But you've probably figured this out by now. This gambling den isn't an ordinary gambling den. A place like this couldn't operate unless powerful people in the Chinese public security system were protecting it. There's a way we can quietly transfer the money into your Korean bank account. That was how Wang Zhang began luring him in. At first, Dolby thought, well then, I could take the amount I'm allowed to carry legally and leave the rest with you. But as you can probably guess, Wang Zhang immediately refused. No, we can't just do part of it. The fees are too high, and these people won't bother moving such a small amount of money. You need to transfer at least 50,000 yuan for them to even be willing to get involved. He kept tempting Dolby. By the time about 3 months had passed, Dolby had accumulated a staggering 100,000 yuan. He had, in a sense, won a huge amount of money. At today's exchange rate, that would be more than 20 million won. Even based on the exchange rate and prices at the time, it would have been close to 17 million won. With stacks of cash sitting right in front of him, Dolby's determination to turn his life around had pretty much disappeared. He was completely consumed by gambling again. And because he was so deep into it, he began to lose trust in his senior co-workers as well. So he called Wang Zhang. I have about 100,000 yuan. Can you really do this? Of course I can. Come to this place. Wang Zhang told him where to go. It was the gambling den they had been visiting. But this is where I began to wonder. Why did Dolby trust Wang Zhang so completely? The answer was simple. In a foreign country, Wang Zhang was the only person Dolby felt was truly on his side. So he trusted him completely and went to meet him. When Dolby arrived, Wang Zhang took him into a VIP lounge. Until then, the gambling den they had been visiting was basically just a warehouse with tables set up for gambling. But this place was different. It was a private, room-like area. Wang Zhang introduced Dolby to someone, saying, "This is an older brother I really trust." Even then, Dolby was nervous. After all, he was in China, and going into some secluded, unfamiliar place naturally made him worry that something dangerous might happen. But then, someone who appeared to be a very powerful man came out. At first glance, he looked like an extremely wealthy Chinese businessman, wearing expensive luxury goods and carrying himself like someone with a lot of influence. The man came out, and when he hugged Dolby, Dolby thought, "Ah, Wang Zhang really is on my side. He really did introduce me to someone who can help me." The man looked wealthy and powerful, so Dolby didn't think he would try to harm him. The man asked, "So, did you bring the money?" "Yes, I did." "How much did you bring?" When Dolby told him, the man said, "Then don't give it to me. Just put it over there for now." He then told Dolby that they needed to build a guanxi relationship. Guanxi is a concept in Chinese culture involving personal connections and relationships, especially in business. It's about building a relationship based on trust and mutual connections. The man told him, "You're probably going to be coming to China often from now on. Through us, I'll make sure your money can be safely transferred to Korea. Come on, let's have a drink together. Let's build a brotherly relationship." As he said this, several bottles of alcohol were brought out. Dolby had already been in China for about 4 months by then, so he had learned which kinds of alcohol were expensive and which kinds were usually served to people of high status, and the bottles being brought out were exactly that kind of expensive liquor. The man treated him incredibly well. They poured him expensive alcohol, and Dolby kept drinking. At that point, he had absolutely no reason to suspect anything. All he could think was, Wang Jiang introduced me to this guy. He really is someone who wants to help me. He's treating me like a brother. Maybe my life is finally turning around. And so, he drank with them and spent the evening in a warm, friendly atmosphere. After spending some time drinking with them, Dolby eventually lost consciousness. When he came to, he opened his eyes in a bed inside a small room. There was no money anywhere, and he was lying there wearing nothing but his underwear. Outside, it was dark. The only light came from the kind of dim, yellowish lighting you often see in old dramas or movies. Beyond the room, he could see what appeared to be a wooded area. His first thought was, did I do something stupid while I was drunk? He didn't immediately think he had been kidnapped. Since the gambling den he had been going to was basically a warehouse, he assumed. Maybe they just put me somewhere to sleep. He reached for the door, expecting it to be locked, but it opened. When he stepped outside and looked around, he immediately realized something was wrong. This wasn't the place he had been gambling at. He had never seen this place before. He slowly looked around and noticed a large green metal gate. He tried to open it, but it was locked. The place itself had a strange warehouse-like atmosphere, almost like a collection of tiny rooms similar to a Korean goshiwon. And inside the entire building, Dolby appeared to be the only person there. By this point, he began to realize something is seriously wrong. Of course, he was terrified. But at the same time, another thought crossed his mind. Wait, I still have a chance to escape. I'm not tied up. Nothing seems to be physically wrong with me. I might still be able to get out of here. And that small realization gave him a glimmer of hope. But then, at that moment, he suddenly heard Wang Jiang's voice coming through a speaker, almost like an announcement over an intercom. Just lie down. There's nowhere for you to run anyway. Lie down. I'll come get you later. Just lie down. When Dolby heard Wang Jiang's voice, he realized, there must be CCTV cameras here. They've been watching me this whole time. They just threw me in here and left me. That was when he realized that something was seriously wrong. And from that moment on, the fear really began to set in. Dolby was in China as a traveler. That made him difficult to find. He was also in the middle of a 2-week period of free time after the project had ended. Even if he didn't return to the accommodation, his senior co-workers probably wouldn't report him missing to the Chinese authorities for at least a week. And by then, he began thinking, I have to get out of here within that week. Something is going to happen to me if I don't. For about 2 days, they simply left him there. They didn't give him any food. They didn't give him any water. They just left him there until he was almost completely out of strength. Then, around the 3rd day, he began to hear voices from outside. It sounded like 2 men talking quietly. Dolby was so weak that he kept drifting in and out of sleep. It was the first time he had heard human voices in 2 days. Since they weren't giving him any water, he had survived by drinking the dirty, rusty water that dripped from an old pipe. You know, the kind of water that slowly drips from old plumbing. He had been drinking that just to keep himself alive and conscious. Then he heard the men talking outside. There was one phrase in Chinese that he clearly understood. Is he still alive? The moment he heard that, Dolby thought, this is my only chance to escape. He knew they were going to open the door and come inside. And if he got out and found another exit, or discovered that the place was locked up somehow, he knew that none of that mattered. If he was caught again, he believed he would be killed. So he decided, I have to fight with everything I have. I'm going to struggle as hard as I can. And if I can't escape any other way, I'm prepared to fight for my life. The moment the door opened, Dolby slammed his entire body into it. He hit it with all his strength. The door flew open. The two men standing outside were knocked off balance and fell over. Dolby immediately ran toward the light he could see outside. Fortunately, he spotted a staircase leading down. He started running down the stairs as fast as he could. But then he heard someone coming up from below. The people upstairs were shouting and chasing after him, while someone below was yelling, "What happened?" And then he heard footsteps coming up the stairs. From Dolby's perspective, people were coming after him from above, while someone else was coming up from below. He thought, if I get caught here, they're going to kill me, or something even worse is going to happen. So, without even thinking, he threw himself through a window beside the staircase. He didn't even know how high up he was. He was in a state of complete panic and simply threw himself out. Later, he learned that he had been on the 3rd floor. He jumped from the 3rd floor, and of course, this wasn't a movie. There was no car or truck conveniently waiting below to break his fall. He landed directly on the ground. When he hit the ground, Dolby thought his arms and legs might have been broken. Even then, Dolby knew that if he collapsed there because of his injuries, he knew exactly what would happen. His only thought was, I have to keep running. I don't care how much it hurts. I have to get somewhere. So he started running. And then, almost like a miracle, he saw a sign for a restaurant that sold tomato and egg fried rice, a place he used to visit frequently. The reason seeing that sign felt like a gift from heaven was simple. He knew this place. Dolby knew that there was an alley behind the restaurant. He had been there many times before and knew that there were garbage bins where they threw away food waste. So he ran into that alley. At the time, he could hear people shouting and making a commotion all around him. His arm was in terrible pain, but he bit down on it to distract himself from the pain and kept going. He could still hear the voices getting closer. And then, just as he reached the entrance to the alley, something incredibly lucky happened. The owner of the tomato and egg restaurant opened the door. He must have heard the commotion outside and opened the door to see what was going on. The person who had been chasing Dolby was, in a way, just a third party. He simply walked past the restaurant. The moment Dolby saw the man pass by, he begged the restaurant owner, "Please save me." The owner recognized him because Dolby had been a regular customer. He looked at Dolby's condition and asked, "What happened? Should I call the police? Do you need to go to a hospital?" But Dolby immediately shook his head. No. He couldn't trust anyone anymore. He had no phone. He had nothing. The only person he could contact was the second most senior writer from his team. The reason he could remember her number was because, when they went to China, they had all gotten local Chinese phone numbers since their Korean numbers didn't work there. And incredibly, the last few digits of her Chinese number happened to be the same as the number she used in Korea. The number had been randomly assigned, so it was pure coincidence. But that coincidence meant Dolby could remember her number. He called her. She didn't answer the first time. On the second attempt, she picked up. "Uni, it's me. It's Dolby. I'm hiding in some house right now. Please come get me. I don't know what to do. My hands are shaking so badly and I'm terrified. Please come get me." Then he hung up. He couldn't stay on the phone for long because the phone was in a place where someone outside might be able to see him. So he quickly ended the call and hid again. About 20 minutes later, the second most senior writer arrived in a taxi. "Dolby? Dolby?" When he heard her calling his name, Dolby cautiously peeked his head out. She had really come. Dolby immediately got into the taxi with her and went straight to the airport. He hurriedly returned to Korea wearing nothing more than the simple clothes he had on. Fortunately, his passport was still at the hotel, so he was able to return to Korea without any problems. Fortunately, Dolby managed to escape from the organization, but naturally, we all want to know what happened afterward. The second most senior writer eventually told the whole story to the senior writer who had originally arranged the trip, as well as to Dolsoon, my acquaintance. After quietly listening to the entire story, the senior writer said, "I'm sorry, I think I chose the wrong broker." She had traveled back and forth to China quite a lot, so she had some experience with how these arrangements worked. According to her, Korean television writers often ended up carrying large amounts of cash while working in China. In Dolby's case, the visa issue had meant that he was paid in cash. And if a junior writer was given a substantial amount of money for living expenses, then more experienced writers, who had been working in the industry for longer, would naturally be carrying even larger amounts of cash. Because Korean writers often ended up carrying large amounts of cash, there were apparently brokers and people pretending to be brokers who were connected to criminal organizations who specifically targeted them. Sometimes these people would take someone somewhere and rob them of all their cash at once. As for Dolby's case, the senior writer believed that if gambling had been the reason he was targeted, then Dolby must have done something that had caused the people there to turn against him. Perhaps he had made some kind of mistake while drinking, because if the people who took Dolby had simply wanted his money, they would never have kept him alive for that long. The fact that he was left alive for 2 days suggested that there may have been some kind of personal grudge or revenge involved, and that might be the reason Dolby survived. The senior writer then said, "I'm telling all of you this because I don't want something like this to happen again. Whenever possible, don't carry large amounts of cash around. And there is no legitimate way to secretly transfer money to Korea through illegal means. That's why I told you all that having the proper visa and opening a bank account are so important. Use the money you earn while you're there. It's safer to spend it there and return home safely." And that was how the story came to an end.